Welcome to The Untold Story with Scott Knuckles, where each episode is designed to stir your faith, anchor your hope, and awaken a deeper love for God, for others, and for yourself. As C.S. Lewis once said, hardships often prepare ordinary people for an extraordinary destiny. If this story moves you, would you be sure to follow the show, leave a rating, and share it with someone who needs it? Let's dive into today's story.
Welcome to today's podcast titled, Are the Ravens Feeding You? Did you know there was DoorDash in Elijah's day? Not a guy in a red hoodie with a thermal bag. No app. No order tracking. But food still showed up, twice a day. Morning and evening, right on schedule. The delivery system? Ravens. Not doves. Not angels. Ravens. Scavengers? Unclean birds? Creatures no devout Israelite would ever expect God to use? And yet God said, I have commanded the ravens to feed you there. Picture it. Elijah, isolated by a death threat from King Ahab, a drought choking the land, no allies, no answers, just a trickling brook and a sky full of unlikely help. Bread and meat in the morning, bread and meat in the evening. We don't know where the food came from. Some scholars suggest the ravens brought scraps from real kitchens, maybe even from Ahab's own table. Others believe it was wilderness fare or divinely multiplied bread like the manna in the desert. Either way, the message is clear. The provision was consistent, but the source, completely unexpected. And this isn't just an ancient story. God still works this way. In the 1800s, George Müller ran orphanages in Bristol, England, caring for thousands of children without ever asking for donations. He simply prayed and trusted God to provide. One morning, there was no food at all for the 300 orphans. No bread, no milk, nothing. Still, Müller had the children sit at the tables and thank God for the meal. Moments later, a knock at the door. The baker, saying God woke him up at 2 a.m. to bake extra bread for the orphanage. Then another knock. The milkman's cart had broken down right outside, and he had to give away all the milk before it spoiled. Every child ate their fill. The ravens had come. Only this time they wore aprons and pushed milk carts. So I have to ask you, are the ravens feeding you? Are you missing God's provision because it doesn't come wrapped the way you expected? Is He meeting your needs through people, situations, or seasons you never would have chosen? Because sometimes the greatest miracle isn't what God gives, it's how He gives it. Let's unpack the Elijah story. If you had ever walked into the court of King Ahab in the mid-9th century BC, you'd have seen wealth, political influence, and idolatry everywhere. King Ahab ruled over Israel during one of its most spiritually bankrupt eras. And it wasn't just political corruption, it was spiritual treason. His queen, Jezebel, was the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Sidonians, and she brought with her the worship of Baal, the so-called storm god. Baal worship was more than just misguided religion. It was a symptom that promised control over rain, crops, and fertility. It was the ancient equivalent of trusting the stock market and the weather app more than trusting God. And the people of Israel, they weren't just dabbling in it. They were bowing to it. They were burning incense to Baal, erecting Asherah poles, and mixing pagan rituals into their lives as if Yahweh God had somehow lost his edge. The same God who split the Red Sea and provided manna in the wilderness was being sidelined for a man-made idol that couldn't make a raindrop fall unless Yahweh allowed it. Into this scene steps a man we've never heard of before, Elijah, the Tishbite. No royal pedigree, no political office, no military rank, just a prophet whose very name means, "My God is Yahweh." And sometimes, the message God sends starts with the messenger's identity. We meet him suddenly in 1 Kings 17:1. "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except in my word." This was no polite sermon. It was a prophetic earthquake, an open challenge to the very heart of Baal worship. No rain meant drought. Drought meant famine. And famine meant political unrest and economic collapse. Elijah's bold declaration was anchored in God's covenant promises and warnings given centuries earlier. We see it in Leviticus 26:18 and 19. "If after all of this you will not listen to me, I will break down your stubborn pride and make the sky above you like iron and the ground beneath you like bronze." And in Deuteronomy 11:16 and 17, "Be careful, or you will be enticed to turn away and worship other gods. Then the Lord's anger will burn against you, and he will shut the heavens so that it will not rain, and the ground will yield no produce." And finally, in Deuteronomy 28:23 and 24, "The sky over your head will be bronze, the ground beneath you iron. The Lord will turn the rain of your country into dust and powder. It will come down from the skies until you are destroyed." Elijah wasn't inventing a curse. He was simply announcing that the time had come for God's word to be fulfilled. And by confronting Ahab directly, Elijah was striking at Baal's supposed stronghold, the control of rain. If there would be no rain, then Baal was no god at all. Then, just as quickly as he appeared, God sent Elijah away. We pick up the story in 1 Kings 17:2 through 4. "Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, 'Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have directed the ravens to supply you with food there.'" Think about that. God doesn't just protect his messenger. He sustains him in a way that defies logic. Ravens, as we shared, were unclean birds, according to Leviticus 11:15. Scavengers that didn't even reliably feed their own young. And yet, these unlikely servants became God's chosen delivery system. Morning and evening, bread and meat arrived. Elijah drank from the brook. The Hebrew word lechem, bread, could mean food in general. Could be berries, fruit, and nuts, possibly brought from areas untouched by drought. It wasn't a lavish feast. It was enough, however. And sometimes enough is the greatest miracle of all. The Kerith ravine was not a vacation spot for Elijah. It was a secluded, rugged, and probably lonely hideout east of the Jordan River. The very name Kerith comes from a root meaning to cut off or to separate. That's exactly what God was doing. He was cutting Elijah off from the public stage and separating him for a season of preparation. There's a truth here that we don't often like. Before God uses us publicly, he often shapes us privately. Kerith moments are where our self-reliance dies and dependence on God grows deep roots. For Elijah, this meant trusting a seasonal brook for water and scavenger birds for food. The very drought he had announced would eventually claim his own water source. And yet, day after day, God's promise held true. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook. It's interesting. God didn't give Elijah a month's supply of food all at once. There was no pantry in that ravine, no extra jugs of water stored up, just daily bread, daily meat, daily trust. Doesn't that sound familiar? It echoes the manna in the wilderness. Israel gathered what they needed for that day, no more, no less. And it foreshadows the words of Jesus in Matthew 6:11. "Give us today our daily bread. Daily bread teaches us daily trust. But as verse 7 says, sometime later the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. The brook's drying wasn't God's failure. It was his first step. Elijah had learned that God could command the sky and feed him through the scavenger birds. Now he was about to learn that God could provide in even stranger ways. Imagine the tension. This was the place God told him to go. This was the provision God promised him. And now the water is gone. No more trickle, just dust. Has that ever happened to you? God leads you to a job, a ministry, a relationship, a situation, and it sustains you for a season. But then, without warning, it dries up. When that happens, our first instinct might be to panic or think we've missed God's will. But sometimes, a drying brook is not a sign of God's absence. It's an indicator that he's about to move us into the next chapter. God had used the ravens to show Elijah his faithfulness. Now he would use a widow to show Elijah his power in the most unlikely of places. We pick up the story in 1 Kings 17:8 and 9. Then the word of the Lord came to him, "Go at once to Zarephath, in the region of Sidon, and stay there. I have directed a widow there to supply you with food." Zarephath was about 80 to 90 miles from Kerith, located in Phoenicia, the very heartland of Baal worship, and the homeland of Jezebel herself. Can you believe that? If Kerith was isolation, Zarephath was infiltration. Elijah was walking straight into enemy territory, and the provider God had chosen, not a wealthy landowner, maybe a secret supporter of Yahweh, a widow. In the ancient world, widows were among the most vulnerable members of society. They had no social safety net, no means of income, and in times of famine, they were often the first to starve. When Elijah arrived at the town gate, he saw her gathering sticks. She wasn't just preparing a meal, she was preparing for the end. "Would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink?" he asked her. She turned to get it, but then he added, "And bring me, please, a piece of bread." Her reply reveals the desperation in her soul. "As surely as the Lord your God lives, I don't have any bread. Only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I'm gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die." She's at the end of her rope, holding on by a single thread of survival. And here comes Elijah, hungry, tired, dusty from a long journey, asking her for the very last of what she has. Wouldn't you agree that most of us, in that moment, would back off? But we can see how obedient she was. Her response demonstrated her faith in the word of the Lord. The Lord would indeed honor her faith by fulfilling his promise miraculously. Elijah presses forward, not out of selfishness, but because God had already told him this widow was part of his plan. "Don't be afraid. Go home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. But first, she had to act before she saw the provision, before she tasted it, before she knew how it would happen. This is what faith looks like. Taking God at his word before you see the result. It's the same principle Jesus taught centuries later in Luke 6:38. Give, and it will be given to you. For with the measure you use, it will be measured to you. So she went. She made the bread. She gave first, and the miracle began. Verse 15 and 16. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word of the Lord spoken by Elijah. This wasn't a one-time blessing. This was sustained provision for the rest of the famine. And it all started with obedience in the face of lack. The story of Elijah and the widow may seem far removed from our modern lives, but God hasn't changed. The way He provides may look different, but the principle is the same. And one of the clearest examples in more recent history is the life of George Müller. George Müller was born in 1805 in Prussia, which is modern-day Germany. His early life was anything but godly. He was a thief, a liar, and a gambler. By his own admission, he was deeply selfish and morally careless. But at the age of 20, he experienced a dramatic conversion to Jesus, and everything changed. A few years later, Müller felt a call to ministry in England. It was there in the city of Bristol that he encountered the heartbreaking reality of orphaned and abandoned children living on the streets. Many were cold, hungry, and left to survive however they could. The conditions were appalling. Müller knew he couldn't ignore it. In 1836, with no steady source of income and no promise of financial support, he and his wife opened their first orphanage. Here's what made Müller's approach so radical. He refused to ever ask anyone for money. No fundraising letters, no public appeals, no personal pleas to wealthy donors. Instead, he prayed. He told his needs to God alone, believing that if God was truly in the work, God would provide for it. And along the way, story after story emerged of God's provision, often arriving at the very last moment. One of the most famous accounts happened on a cold morning when there was no food at all, not a crumb in the pantry, not a drop of milk, not a penny to buy supplies. The children, about 300 of them, were already dressed for school. The tables were set, but they were empty. There was no breakfast to serve. Müller, fully aware of the situation, calmly asked the children to sit at the tables. He then bowed his head and thanked God for the food he would provide. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. It was the local baker. He explained that God had woken him up in the night, prompting him to bake extra bread for the orphanage. He delivered enough for every child to eat. A few minutes later, another knock. This time, it was the milkman. His cart had broken down right outside the orphanage, and the milk would spoil before he could fix it. Could the orphanage use it? Of course they could. Every child had bread and milk for breakfast. More than enough. Doesn't that sound familiar? Ravens in the morning. Ravens in the evening. Maybe he read the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000 with a few loaves of bread and a few fish. Provision at just the right time from unexpected sources. George Müller's journals record thousands of such moments. Müller's life teaches us something Elijah also knew. God's provision is never late, but it's rarely early. It comes in His timing, in His unique way, and often through the most unlikely channels. The stories of Elijah and George Müller are inspiring, but they're not just isolated examples. They're real-life echoes of what God has promised His people again and again in Scripture. Let's walk through some of those promises and ask ourselves, do we believe they apply to us today? Luke 12:24 says, "Consider the ravens. They do not sow or reap. They have no storeroom or barn, yet God feeds them. And how much more valuable you are than birds." Jesus didn't pick ravens by accident here. He chose an unclean scavenger bird to make His point. If God can feed something so insignificant in human eyes, how much more will He care for you and me, His beloved children? And what about Philippians 4:19? "And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Paul doesn't say some of your needs. He says all, and not according to the economy or your paycheck or the generosity of others, but according to his glory. That's an inexhaustible supply. In Psalm 23:1, no doubt many of us have read many times over, "The Lord is my shepherd. I lack nothing." David doesn't say, "I have everything I want." He says, "I lack nothing." In other words, I have everything I truly need because I live in him. I love 2 Corinthians 9:8. And God is able to bless you abundantly, so that in all things, at all times, having all that you need, you will abound in every good work. God doesn't just meet needs. He overflows provision so you can bless others. This is one that my wife Carrie quotes so often when praying for others in a financial hardship. It's found in Psalm 37:25. I was young and now I am old, yet I have never seen the righteous forsaken or their children begging bread. David had lived long enough to see a pattern. God never abandons his own. These verses aren't for others, but for you and me. They are the living reality Elijah knew by the brook, the widow knew in her kitchen, and George Müller knew in his orphanage dining hall. It is a word that is for you and me. When you step back and look at Elijah's journey, you see something remarkable. It starts with him confronting a king in the palace. Then God sends him to a hidden ravine where those birds fed him. Then God sends him on an 80 to 90-mile journey to enemy territory to be fed by a widow with nothing, or almost nothing. Each step is more improbable than the last. And yet, at every step, God's provision is there. Not early, not late, just in time. In the brook of Kerith, God proved that he could command the most unlikely creatures to deliver his promises. In the kitchen of Zareth, he proved that he could turn scarcity into daily abundance. And George Müller's life adds a modern chapter to the same story. Prayers answered in ways no one could predict. Needs met through channels no one could have orchestrated. The ravens came in the form of bakers and milkmen, in envelopes slipped through doors, and supplies arriving the moment they were needed. Here's the thread that ties them all together. God's provision rarely comes in the way we expect. Elijah didn't worship the brook. The widow didn't worship the flour jar. Müller didn't worship the donors. They all worship the one who provides. And that's the challenge for you and me today. Can we trust God's provision when it comes in a package we didn't order? But here's the truth. Sometimes God sends ravens instead of doves. Sometimes he sends widows instead of kings. Sometimes he sends provision that's just enough for today, because that's all we need to grow in faith for tomorrow. As we've seen through these two stories, trusting in God's provision isn't just about surviving the moment. It's about preparing for the mission. Elijah, who depended on those ravens to bring him bread and food, would later stand on Mount Carmel and call down fire from heaven. But that faith was forged in the quiet, hidden days at Kerith and Zareth. It's one thing to trust God when you have abundance and plenty. It's another thing entirely to trust him when all you have is a raven and a brook. Elijah's provision came in the form of bread and meat morning and night. Not a stockpile, not a year's worth of food, just enough for that day, no more. And that daily dependence is exactly where many of us find ourselves right now. Maybe your ravens don't look miraculous. Maybe they're a friend's encouraging text or phone call saying they feel like they are supposed to help you. Maybe they're an unexpected refund that covers the bill you didn't know how to pay. And maybe you're looking at a dry brook. Maybe the thing that sustained you in the last season is gone. The job, the relationship, the opportunity. If that's you, remember this. The drying brook isn't punishment, it's positioning. God is leading you to the next chapter. And often, the provision in the next chapter looks even stranger than the last. The widow's handful of flour and small jug of oil didn't look like a miracle, but it was. It didn't come all at once. It came day by day, just enough for the moment. Don't miss what God is doing because it doesn't look like what you pictured. Don't cling to yesterday's ravens when God is calling you to tomorrow's miracle. Don't mourn the dried up brook when an overflowing jar is waiting ahead, because the provision may change, but God's presence and purposes never will. We can take confidence from these stories and trust the promises we see in Philippians 4:19. And my God will meet all your needs according to the riches of his glory in Christ Jesus. Not according to the economy, not according to what you see in that bank account, according to his infinite resources and perfect timing. Because after all, we're supposed to depend on him for everything. So today, let me ask you one last time. Are the ravens feeding you? And will you trust the God who can shut the heavens to open the strangest, most unexpected doors? We saw this with George Müller, whose faith led to a miraculous work, and as he trusted, his orphanages grew, eventually overseeing 5 large homes that cared for over 10,000 children in his lifetime. And through his unwavering faith, Müller received over 1 million in unsolicited donations, never once asking anyone, yet trusting God fully that he would provide. And then there's Elijah, one of the greatest prophets to ever walk this earth. A man who at one point was hunted by a king who searched the ends of his kingdom to find him. Yet Elijah boldly confronted that king again, calling down fire from heaven to defeat the prophets of Baal. His life was marked by miraculous provision because he trusted that God would provide in the most unexpected ways. If God were speaking to us right now, he would ask, "Why won't you trust me for what you need? Why are you looking to others to satisfy what only I can provide? Why not turn to me first instead of last? Haven't I already shown myself to be trustworthy and true? I have what you need. I know what you need before you even ask. I stand ready to supply your every need. Steady yourself through the drought and strengthen yourself in me. I will see you through to the other side. I love you, and I have a plan for you. My ways are higher than your ways, and my thoughts are higher than your thoughts. Come to me through the storms of your life, and I will meet you there. I will take care of you." God bless you. Thanks for listening to today's episode. If it encouraged you, would you take a moment to rate the podcast, follow the show, and share it with someone who needs a word of hope? You can also visit us at scottnuckles.com for more resources and updates. Until next time, blessings.